Well, I'm going to invite now back to the podium our Bible study leader, Dr. Tara Rao. As we introduced her yesterday, she is on faculty at the University of North Texas and is a specialist in environmental ethics. And she presented us with a overarching sort of theme of thinking about ecological ethics and theological reflection. And she teased you at the end yesterday that we're going to talk about oil. Do we know anything about oil here in Texas? Yeah, I think this building that we're sitting in was probably built with some petrodollars. That's part of our economy here in the state of Texas. It's a reality. So it's important for us to think about all of these things in the context of where we live. How do we value things? And so, Dr. Rao, thank you so much for being with us. We're grateful for your presence, and welcome back.
Thank you, Bishop. Good morning. Oops. All right. So this morning, I want to look a little more closely at this relationship between nature and grace that I started introducing us to yesterday, especially with the work of Joseph Sittler. And I want to look in particular at the ways that more current day religion and ecology scholars have, at least since Joseph Sittler, been diagnosing the problem of environmental destruction from a religious lens. And they're diagnosing that oftentimes as from the perspective of disenchantment, of a modern condition of human beings becoming disenchanted with the world, losing a sense of the sacred in the world around us. But first, let's talk a little bit about theophany. So there are instances of theophany in the Bible, and a theophany is just very simply a visible manifestation of divinity in the natural world. One of the most famous theophanies in the Bible is Moses and the burning bush. So let's read this text together, and then I'll invite you to, again, turn to someone sitting next to you to discuss a couple questions for a few minutes. So a reading from Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." The Lord saw that he had turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the Lord of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So turning to a neighbor, I'd like you to discuss, what does it suggest about God's relation to creation that God can show up, be manifest in nature? What does this imply about God? What does this imply about nature? Okay, take a few minutes. Hey, let's bring it back to the large group. Thank you, everybody, for your conversations with one another. Again, I so wish I could have listened to all of them. I'd love to hear some of your responses, after in between sessions. And we're going to return to this idea of theophany. But eco-theologians since Joseph Sittler have often emphasized the importance of identifying places where the sacred seems to intersect with the natural world. They emphasize that the mysterious, enchanting, wondrous aspects of nature can evoke stronger environmental ethics, can call us to care for particular places, and then fight to protect and preserve them. I think that this has been important work that has gone on by eco-theologians. But there's been some aspects of the ways that my current research has been directing me that's causing me to want to rethink aspects of it. This is a little bit of what I mean. So many eco-theologians have emphasized, like Joseph Sittler, and even back to Ernst Haeckel. Remember, Ernst Haeckel already early in the 1800s they were talking about the environment, ecology, and in the environmental crisis, not just as a crisis that's rooted in economic policy, resource policy, or infrastructural problems. Rather, they consistently emphasize that the environmental crisis is also rooted in a spiritual crisis. Namely, that spiritual crisis they often identify is a loss of meaning, of shared values in the modern world. Where ancient or more medieval people could have experienced God in nature as Moses did, modern people, according to this perspective, have lost that ability. Many articulate this in terms of the problem of disenchantment. Disenchantment is a common sense that with the emergence of modern science and capitalism, we have lost an important sense of nature as enchanted, as sacred, and having worth beyond its utility or its use value, right? It has only its use value, nothing like a meaning value or something beyond that, a sacred value. And this is a broadly held narrative, this idea of disenchantment. The term comes from sociologist Max Weber, and much of the critiques of modern human and environmental problems assume this framework. So many religious and non-religious environmentalists and scholars have proposed the importance of re-enchanting or re-sacralizing the natural world. This is a key point of current debate among eco-theologians today. Here's just a few examples of the many scholars and eco-theologians who are finding it important to re-enchant, re-sacralize the natural world. We have up here Aleister Mcgrath, and his really important, Aleister Mcgrath is both a priest and a scientist. His text is called Re-Enchanting Nature. Mark Wallace is as a religious scholar, a theologian. He has a recent text called Christianity, Animism, and the Re-Enchantment of the World. And here we see many other examples. And there are even examples of non-religious folk who see the value, the importance of re-enchanting the material world. So one of the reasons that I've come to question this narrative is through the work of Jason Josephson Storm. That idea of modernity associated with disenchantment has recently been called into question by Jason Storm, who's a religion scholar. His 2017 book, The Myth of Disenchantment, the myth, right, of disenchantment, he argues that disenchantment is, quote, the single most familiar story in the history of science. And it's actually a myth. Why does he argue this? A couple points, many points, but I'm just going to focus on two. First of all, he argues that the idea of modernity as inherently disenchanted is a myth because it is grounded in the conflict thesis. So the conflict thesis is the idea, also very commonly held, maybe you don't know the precise terms of it, but I think we all know it. The idea that religion and science are inherently at odds, they're inherently at war, at conflict with one another. right? This is still a very common understanding, a common way to characterize the relationship between religion and science. But it's important to realize that this idea of religion and science inherently at combat and at conflict with one another is relatively recent. It was first articulated in the late 19th century, right? So there's evidence much before that and even after that religion and science have interacted with one another in many different ways, one of which is conflict, but other ways in harmony, sometimes in dialogue, sometimes in integration with one another, right? And so the conflict thesis really misses out and reduces the relationship of religion and science just to conflict. So this thesis, the conflict thesis, has been problematized and widely dismissed by historians of science, scholars of religion and science, and most recently by critical religion and science scholars. So that's one reason that Storm is calling into question the disenchantment thesis. A second reason is the empirical evidence that he points to. He has a whole chapter on this. I'm just going to point to a few things, but I can identify some of the many studies that he points to. He says that even in the heart of the supposed disenchanted world, namely Europe and North America, we have never been fully disenchanted. We all know, I think, that church membership in the US and mainline churches is on the decline. However, that's not the whole story. This isn't the case, first of all, across the globe. Recent Pew research demonstrates that worldwide, religious observance is not on the decline, but on the incline, right? So that's worldwide. We don't see this broad kind of secularization or disenchantment narrative continuing on inevitably towards the future. But then Storm points to research like this to argue that even empirically, we can't say that the world is gradually becoming more and more disenchanted. So that's worldwide. But then what does that say? How do we look at North America and Europe, the heart of the disenchanted world? Storm relies on multiple studies from researchers like Baylor University, Pew Research, and many more to demonstrate that even where religious observance has declined, like in places like the US and Europe, more people than ever, even in the US and Europe, believe in different forms of enchantment. Things like ghosts, spirits, communication with the dead, angels, demons, UFOs, etc. So his point is that church attendance does not necessarily mean that people are less enticed by various enchantments in general, right? Therefore, Storm concludes, religion and science are often not at war with one another. More rational explanation of the world, like science, has not always meant less and less religious, supernatural, or enchanted belief. He says often they piggyback on one another. New science, for example, can provoke new articulations, expressions, or experiences of religion. Religious beliefs or phenomena can provoke new and different scientific exploration. This is what he means by science and religion piggybacking off of one another. He gives one example, and then I'll give another from my research. One example that he gives is Marie Curie, two-time Nobel Prize-winning, hard-nosed scientists, as a regular visitor of seance parlors, right? So this kind of blows our understanding of what a hard-nosed scientist should be. And Storm emphasized that it's her research in radioactive materials, that sense that there is something in the material world that is beyond our sense perception, that is out there that starts to evoke some of her curiosity of what these seance things are. And then conversely, Marie Curie was not the only one, there was a wide variety of scientists who were very interested in studying the phenomena of seances. Right, of what is going on here, and can this be empirically verified, right? So in this way, religion and science were not pushing one another out of bounds. They were piggybacking off of one another. Another example from my own research is with Antebellum Evangelicals. Before the Civil War, early evangelicals in the United States were particularly inspired by the sciences of electricity and magnetism. And those sciences then transformed and influenced the ways that they understood and talked about what it meant to have a conversion experience. So scholars point out, last time I pointed to the work of historian Malcolm Granger, his book on Church in the Wild. He gives fascinating examples of the ways that consistently in conversion narratives among early evangelicals, their understanding, the way that they articulated what it meant to be converted was expressed through the new sciences of electricity, right? So it's new sciences informing, transforming our ways of religious experience. This is not religion and science at conflict. They're piggybacking off of one another, okay? All right. So I think this more critical view on enchantment and the idea that we have never been disenchanted, even in the heart of the supposedly disenchanted world, I think this is particularly important in that many of our current energy and extraction practices seem not to be grounded in a lack or loss of meaning, theology, or spirituality, but an overflow of them onto material practices. So I've identified that a key problem for religion and ecology scholars or eco-theologians. If the only lens, I'm not saying that the disenchantment idea is wrong altogether, that there are certain areas of religion and science at conflict, absolutely. But if that's the only lens that we're going to use to diagnose the current environmental crisis as disenchanted, then current sites of enchantment in the energy sciences, in technology, and of resources will be profoundly obscured and ignored. I found that to be the case in religion and science scholarship, in religion and ecology scholarship. It seems like there's this enormous gap around energy practices. And that's what first got me thinking about this. Why? I mean, there's thousands of articles written on religion and science. Why this energy gap, right? Why are we not talking about energy? And this is what started me thinking about this. Maybe energy in particular doesn't fit the basic framework, the basic mold that we have been kind of taught to understand these problems in. So while the majority of eco-theologians today have taken the route of re-enchanting the world to encourage a stronger environmental ethic, still I think an important, valuable goal, I found it important to attend more closely to existing and remaining enchantments, analyzing the ways that natural resources, technologies, and sciences have been and continue to be enchanted. What kinds of theologies are functioning in and through them? What do they say about God, creation, and redemption? I want to talk about two different examples. The first is in mining and the Reformation. So I don't know about you, but I've studied a lot of Lutheran history and theology, and it had never been made particularly clear to me that the mining boom that is considered to be the start of modern mining happened in Saxony at the precise time and geographical location of the Reformation. If we take this historical context seriously, it seems important to imagine the ways that mining and Reformation piggybacked on one another. One particularly interesting case study is Lutheran pastor Johann Matthias. Johann Matthias lived in the current-day Czech Republic on the border with Germany and witnessed the rapid changes brought about by mining. A successful mining venture allowed him the opportunity to travel to Wittenberg, be trained and ordained by Luther as a pastor, and then was sent back to his hometown by Luther and the Reformers in 1545 as called to be pastor to the miners. He wrote a mining treatise for Luther and the Reformers at Wittenberg and wrote a collection of sermons to miners. Translated, the title that he gave it is Sermons on the Mount. Clever, right? So it's fascinating then to look at the ways that Matthias used his theological lens to interpret mining and how mining then how mining influenced the ways that he thought about theological things like God and grace. Matthias portrayed mining and the Protestant event as wholly intertwined with God's providential aims for the world. Matthias believed in the organic development of minerals. That was the theory from ancient times into early modern times, that minerals were organic themselves. And like plants and animals, they were theorized to develop from one form into their kind of fully perfected form over time with the application of heat. And the idea was that God had planted the minerals as seeds from the beginning of time, leaving them to come to their full development at kind of their divinely appointed moment. And the key during this time also is that those minerals needed to develop over time, but then they also could kind of over-ripen, right? So their kind of full development would be silver. We found silver, right? But then, but they could over-ripen, that was the theory, into something that was less valuable. And so there are instances of pastors praying that they have found, they would find these minerals at the precise divinely appointed time. So again, Matthias believed that he was clearly in a divinely appointed moment. Just as the underdeveloped minerals sat in the earth being perfected over time, so too the gospel message had been proclaimed, was buried, lay in wait, being perfected over time, only to emerge when the reformers mined it and brought it to the light of day. For Matthias, the correspondence of the mining boom and the Reformation were not happenstance. Their simultaneity revealed a divine providential plan. Both the mining boom and the Protestant movement together served as evidence to Matthias that he was living in a time when God's influence was the strongest, when the divine plan was finally coming to fruition. So that's one case study. Another one might be a little more familiar to us: oil and Christianity in America. Another fascinating case study in the enchantment of the natural world with significant environmental implications is with Reverend S.J. Eaton, a Presbyterian pastor in the region of Titusville, Pennsylvania, where the first oil boom in the world took place in 1859. Just 7 years after the first oil strike, Eaton published a book reflecting on the history and religious meaning of this event. Eaton tells the story of oil, like Matthias, as a story of divine creation and redemption. For Eaton, as with Matthias's minerals, oil had been planted as a seed by God, coming to full fruition at the divinely appointed time to serve human need. For him, even this was a new kind of Reformation moment. Oil men were the new reformers, the new Luthers. He writes, quote, "There is a new era just on the threshold, and the whole rested with one earnest, resolute heart. There was pressure of the one great thought, that by some mysterious power had got possession of the man's heart, urging him forward. And likewise, on the other hand, that there was a dread of failure, the fear of ridicule, the shadow that falls so heavily upon men's heart from time to time, when in pursuit of some uncertain object. It reminds us of grand old Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms, crying out, "Here I stand, I can do no other, God help me, amen." So other grand ideas are wrought out, and all grand purposes carried forward under the mysterious guidance of that power that seems invincible in its operations. End quote. And it wasn't just the courageous self-assurance, independent-mindedness, faith, and boldness of these men that made the discovery of oil in Titusville a new Reformation moment for him. For both the Reformation era and the Petra-reformers that Eaton identifies, the thing that possessed them, urging them forward, was grace. In spite of the courageous and tenacious role played by these singular humans, he is clear that the gift of oil was not due to human efforts, labor, or wisdom. Oops. Come on. Can we move ahead? Oh. Now we're back too far. Oh, there we go. There we are. Okay. So this is what he writes. Neither human foresight, nor strong muscle, nor golden coins, nor the perfection of machinery can claim the credit of this vast wealth. Wisdom and power placed it in the rock, and neither man's reason, nor wisdom, nor cunning could reach it until the appointed time had arrived. If it is given freely, with little labor, the grounded of attitude are all the stronger that should influence the hearts of the recipients of this bounty. Here oil emerges not just as gift, but divine gift precisely because it defies rather than supports a work ethic, freely given with little labor, right? Eaton and many others at the beginnings of oil extraction were profoundly enchanted by oil. Many other resources like coal, gold, cotton, railroads had also been previously associated with divine blessing, but oil was particularly prone to theological interpretations. These figures were enchanted by oil's curiously animate characteristics that would break the laws of nature. Oil gurgled and gulped. It made digestive noises, seeming like it was some kind of animate living thing. It started and stopped, seeming to have a mind of its own, like an animate creature. Oil men would provoke and prod their oil wells to perform for their viewers. And it seemed more like divine grace than other previous resources because it seemed to defy a work ethic and then overwhelm with its bounty. One oilman, for example, could labor his whole life and never strike it rich, while another could strike it rich on the first time. And striking oil often led to a geyser of oil that would take days to contain. Gold, too, could make men rich, but it would never overwhelm them with its uncontrollable and staggering abundance. So for Eaton and many Americans, oil seemed to do what divinity did. Not only did it emerge at the beginning of the Civil War and so seem to offer a way to be saved from the economic loss of cotton in the South. This is also something that Eaton identifies, oil as redemptive because it can help heal the nation after and move beyond the Civil War. And for economies on the brink of devastation, oil seemed to restore, give life, animate, make lively, resurrect these dead or dying economies. So oil did what divinity does. But Eaton goes even a step further. Oil isn't just a gift of God. It doesn't just do what God does. It also takes on divine properties. Interestingly, already 7 years into oil extraction, the question was already being asked, are we doing too much too fast? Will this last forever? And so significantly, when Eaton is asked about the limits of oil, he has a whole chapter on this at the end of his book. When he's asked about the limits of oil, his response refers to the limits, or lack thereof, of divinity. His response is, there is no limit, surely, to omnipotence. Asked about the limits of oil, he gives the limits of God. So there's a fascinating slide that Eaton makes here from divine properties to material properties. Since God's power, evident in the world above, is unbounded, so oil's supply under the earth is, he says, exhaustless. And the new ecological implications are stark. He says, a new lesson has been taught the world, that God's treasures are inexhaustible, and that this hand can never be shortened. So trust in God's providence omnipotence for Eaton means trust in unlimited oil. Questioning the limits of oil, therefore, means questioning divine omnipotence. So what happens when something that can be used as a resource to do remarkable things is interpreted through the lens of theophany? What happens when we see oil as a theophany? When it comes to questions of climate change, questions of the environmental and social problems with oil, evidence of the enchantment of oil and the theological interpretations of oil suggest that we have not just made infrastructural, scientific, and mechanistic investments of oil. We've also made spiritual, theological investments in oil. And these, I think, call for theological analysis and response. It also means, then, that our eco-theologies need to shift gears as well, where Sittler emphasized, with good reason, the problem of a lack of attention, of redemption in nature, of viewing creation and redemption together. These petro-theologies suggest that this work is already being done, and sometimes towards not very environmentally friendly ends. So the problem here is not necessarily that creation and redemption have been kept apart. Rather, the key theological problem seems to be a proper interpretation of redemption and grace. How then do we think about divine blessing and natural resources? How do we theologically reflect on resource wealth? How are these blessings? In what way? For whom? And for what ends? Now, one might say, well, that was the 19th century. Things have changed since then. Just hold that thought. Thank you.